Our next speaker is Mr. Amaobi Osuala. Mr. Amaobi Osuala is a lecturer at the Department of Political Science, Chrisland University, Abeokuta. He is currently a doctoral student at the Department of Philosophy, University of Ibadan, Nigeria. His research interests are in African philosophy, decolonial logic, among others. Osuala has published articles in both local and international journals and contributed book chapters to edited collection in reputable international publishing outlets. His talk is titled The Nature of Innocent Asouzu's Complementary Logic. Mr. Osuala, please speak to us. Thank you.
Okay, it is good for me to be here. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the previous speakers. So without taking much time, I will just delve into what I have to discuss today on the nature of Innocent Asouzu's complementary logic. To begin, I think it's better to start a presentation like this by making it clear that obviously there have been so many works written around the works of Innocent Asouzu, especially within the area of his metaphysics, his epistemology, and some other areas. But little has been said on a discourse on his logic, because it appears that so many people seem to find it complicated, so to speak. So I will be standing in as a spokesperson for Asouzu by clarifying and giving an expose of the nature of Asouzu's logic, otherwise known as complementary logic, or put differently, Ijiomah logic. Now, I have an outline here which is quite lengthy, so I will try as much as possible to kind of delve to be fast so that I could be able to reach the high points of my paper. We have an abstract and introduction. Under the introduction, we have Innocent Asouzu's cradle and influences. I have the background to Ijiomah philosophy, the nature of complementary ontology as proposed by the anonymous, those Asouzu calls the anonymous traditional African philosophers. I'll be discussing on the two basic fundamental principles of complementary logic, which include the metaphysical principle of integration and the practical principle of progressive transformation. Thereafter, I will take a bend by trying to give an exegesis on the notion of missing link and how missing links seem to have colored Asouzu's logic. I'll be discussing on the nature and the context of complementary logical reasoning, where I will be focusing on the disjunctive mode of reasoning as well as the conjunctive mode of reasoning. I will also look at the role of transcendent complementary circle, which Asouzu tried to put forward. And in discussing the mode of Ijiomah logical operation, I will try to explain what we mean by the disjunctive mode as well as the conjunctive mode, and how both of them cannot, in their separate modes, serve for a holistic understanding of reality, but they must necessarily complement. And that was where we reached a crescendo, where Asouzu tried to talk about what he called the complementary conjunctive mode of reasoning. After which I will look at the nature of meaning beyond the logic of geographical categorization, as well as the way forward with a discourse of the primacy of noetic propedeutic. Then there are so many things, the nature of supermaxim and the boomerang effect. So let me I will read just the abstracts, and then I will delve into the major high points of this paper, where I will lay about the background and every other thing. In this paper, I argue that Innocent Asouzu's logic is multi-valued. The multivalent character of this logic endorses multiplicity of methods based on complementary conjunctive reasoning. My first task will be to discuss the historical background of complementary logic. Thereafter, I will explain the two basic principles of complementary logic. The first, which is the principle of integration, which according to Asouzu states that anything that exists serves a missing link of reality. The second becomes the practical principle, or progressive transformation. It is that we state that we should allow the limitation of our being to be the cause of our joy. Put differently, that all actions are geared towards the joy of being. I will attempt to show how these two principles influence the two main inferential modes, which is the conjunctive reasoning as well as the disjunctive reasoning. This essay will also focus, Asouzu contends that this mode of reasoning proceeds directly from a divisive two-value logic, that is the disjunctive mode, which is formulated and promoted by Aristotle. It tends to ground ambivalent interests and the tendency to exalt our own unique perception of reality to an absolute, thereby inferiorizing those realities of others. Asouzu developed developed complementary logic as a better framework for grounding social relationships through complementary conjunctive reasoning as against binary opposition. The nature of complementary logic, as I will take some things for granted here, I will take it for granted that we already know what Asouzu's background is, although there are some other things that I will try to look at which will be necessary to our understanding of the nature of his logic. Okay, let me locate slides to a particular point where I can. Okay, let me begin with the basic principle of complementary logic. It is important to punctuate as I look at the nature of Asouzu's Ijiomah logic that within the context of my discourse, I will be using complementarity or complementary logic side by side with Ijiomah logic. Ijiomah becomes the Igbo meaning of complementarity. So now Asouzu's logic is founded on two basic principles. The first is what he calls the metaphysical principle of integration. This principle states that anything that exists serves a missing link of reality. The second principle is what is known as the practical principle of progressive transformation. And it states that we should allow the limitation of our being to be the cause of our joy. Now, why is missing link so pivotal in Asouzu's logic? The notion of missing link is that which permeates Ijiomah philosophy. It is that upon which the principle of Ijiomah imperative is anchored. According to Asouzu, missing links refers to those diverse units that make up an entity within a framework of the whole as they are complementarily related. That you can find in his 2004 text titled The Method and Principle of Complementary Reflection. Furthermore, Asouzu argues that there are those parts that are, although disjointed, and discrete, but are also necessary in ensuring holistic complementation. By that, he was referring to the disjunctive nature of missing links. What that simply means is this: there are two ways in which entities can serve as missing links. The first is by abstraction, while the second is by relation. By abstraction, we tend to abstract things from the whole and view them as separate, isolated, discrete units, as though they are from onset independent and non-related. Take, for instance, you have a desktop computer system which comprises of different parts. You have the monitor, the CPU, the keyboard, and then the hard disk and all the rest. Now, when you try to abstract an aspect of that desktop computer, take, for instance, you have decided to abstract the monitor as a separate unit different from the whole makeup of the computer system. Of course, you and I know that we cannot talk about the complete functioning of a computer system without having the visual, which is the monitor. So abstraction simply means an attempt by the mind to take away an aspect from the whole and to treat that aspect which is separated as though originally from the onset it stands to be different, distinct from the whole, without taking into cognizance of the fact that we cannot talk about that abstracted part without the whole, because they have a relationship. Then the second way in which entities tend to serve as missing link, according to Asouzu, is by relation. Unlike abstraction, here the mode of the mind tends to bring those fragmented units together in relationship or closely to themselves, so much so that they are knitted or fused, after which they are then examined to see the nature of their servitude to one another in relationship to the whole. Now, before I proceed further, it is important for us to understand that in discussing the nature of African logic now as a body of knowledge, we must understand that the African worldview, there's a way the Africans think. Africans think in relation. Africans think in integration. Their way of thinking is not exclusive. It is not divisive. It is not fragmented like what we have in the Western system of thinking, which is Aristotelian logic or the classical logic of Aristotle, where we look at things in binary oppositions. That is not the case within the context of African logic. And that is why the nature of relation is that which plays a vital role in Asouzu's Ijiomah logic. Now, let's take an instance of abstraction and relation. As regards the notion of being, the concept of abstraction is that which makes us assume that in Igbo, that Mado Ede means Kasoyade. What that means is that for one to exist or to be, it means for that person to be alone. That is within the context of abstraction, all right? But when we look at the context of relation, relation, on the other hand, does not consider existence as exclusive, all right? But that which has to do with the whole. And within, we tend to look at relation as to be, which is to exist, simply means to exist in mutual complementary relationship with the other. In Igbo, we say that Ihedum were mekorita. What that means is that everything that exists serves a necessary link to each other. You cannot take away one in order to push forward the other, because there is a necessary, it's just as though we are arguing that there's a web of interrelational existence in reality. It is premised on this notion of relation that Asouzu argues that within the complementary logic, everything that exists does so in relation to one another. This is a very important point which we must note while in our discourse of Asouzu's logic. Now, what is complementary logic or Ijiomah logic? It is important to punctuate that the nature of Asouzu's complementary logic is that which deals with relation, in that it projects a form of relationship between all existent realities to each other in a manner of mutual service. In complementary logic or Ijiomah logic, there is such possibility for seemingly incompatible opposites and contraries to coexist. What Asouzu is saying here is that when you have two opposed entities, those entities, they must necessarily complement, all right? They do not serve as die-hard rivalries to themselves, but rather each of them serves a missing link to the other. That is the point Asouzu was trying to make. Now, Asouzu, in an attempt to reflect on the various researches that is done, within the context of the African philosophical landscape, he talked about what is known as the logic of geographical categorization. In his Ijiomah Complementary Ontology, 2007, Asouzu informed that there are as many forms of logic as we have diverse people and their worldviews. Our first speaker, Professor Uchaga, had tried to clarify this area, that what we call African logic is not that which is exclusive to the African experience, but that which is capable of being universalizable. But where we have a problem, of what we call African logic, it's where we limit that our supposed cognition to a position where we cannot reflect or apply it to other worldviews. This, however, does not mean that Asouzu supports or is arguing for a regional or a geographic logic. Now, Asouzu, even though he argues that there are different shades to reality, different individuals have different worldviews. There's a way in which there's a particular way, a unique way in which the Africans, understand their world, interpret their world, their cultural experiences are different from the way in which the Westerners understand or interpret it. But that does not mean that Asouzu is in a way proposing or arguing for what Chimakonam calls cultural logic, or what he has tagged the logic of geographical categorization.
Sorry, Mr. Nelson, sorry to cut in. Please try to round up in the next 7 minutes. Please,
okay,
thank you.
Okay, 7 minutes. Okay, let's see what you can do with that. Okay, let me try to. Now, let's talk about the method pluralism. According to Asouzu, the notion of method pluralism is that which transcends the limitation of a two-valued, three-valued, quadruple-valued, and what have you. Asouzu had argued against all these other forms of logical valuations, like the two-valued logic, the monistic logic, or the single-valued logic, the three-valued logic, as that which is colored usually by sentiments, emotions, an attempt to he calls them a reactionary logic, an attempt to prove that because the Westerners have a two-valued logic, and then Aristotle proposed a two-valued logic, Africans can also do the same. And that was why he criticized forms of logic like the Yoruba logic, Igbo logic, and every other form of logic as that which is crystallized by the problem of exclusionism and the issues about division, all right? Asouzu therefore argues that all these two-valued, three-valued, four-valued, and every other value logic is that which is limited because they tend to trigger ethnocentric reductions. Philosophical inquiry, according to Asouzu, can take many approaches, from bivalent to multivalent logical systems. He therefore favors what he calls the method pluralism, which to my mind is akin to multi-value system, wherein the idea of discrimination and lopsidedness will be whittled down. Now, there are some modes of Igbo and Danda logic. We have what is called the disjunctive mode and then the conjunctive mode. In discussing the disjunctive mode or the disjunctive logical reasoning, this simply means an approach in which we tend to look at reality from a short-circuited standpoint, wherein we tend to look to see things only as black and white, as they are presented to us from our limited vantage points. This disjunctive logical reasoning is akin to Beverly Flaxington's 2019 notion of filters. It does simply that which can be explained with this example. Goggle, all right, a red lens. The outside world there, I will see the world as colored red. That is the problem that is created by the disjunctive logical reasoning that limits our thinking, to some kind of exclusive, myopic, biased, and sentimental way of thinking. In committing to the details of the disjunctive mode, we tend to see the world in a disjuncted mode, wherein only one or two given alternatives seems to be admissible. Let's look at the conjunctive mode. The conjunctive mode, on the other hand, is that which makes it possible for missing links to be grasped within a mutually related and complementary framework. It is a viable option compared to the disjunctive mode in that it helps to mediate and reconcile effectively conflicting and contending alternatives between the necessary and the contingent, between the universal, the particular, between what is mine and what is thine, between those who are indigenous and then those who are strangers. That is what the conjunctive modes would help us to achieve. Then Asouzu talked about what is called the complementary conjunctive reasoning. What we call reality is simply a composite of opposites and negative missing links. In order to ensure a complementary conjunctive reasoning, there must be a way in which the mind will reconcile those aspects of reality that are disjunctive with those that are conjunctive. Although the former, that is, the disjunctive reasoning, can impair and impede our effort to steer a genuine complementary course, it can also contribute to improving the way we relate to the totality of reality, if not only indirectly. As I conclude, let me quickly wrap up because of the time. All right. There's something very important which I must delve into. That is the notion of noetic propedeutic. By noetic propedeutic, as Asouzu meant a pre-education of the mind. What the problem is that the reason why we look at things or reality from a disjunctive perspective is because of what Asouzu calls the phenomenon of concealment, that is inhempuchanya, which happens to be that which impairs our sight. You know, it's like somebody who is suffering from myopia. The person cannot see afar. All right. So Asouzu is saying that when the mind is educated, consciously educated through a process he calls noetic propedeutic, or in Igbo, Ima Onwe Onye, that is the realization of oneself. When you realize yourself consciously within the faculty of your reasoning, that before now you have always been looking at things from a perspective, forgetting that there are different shades of reality, and that this reality, though different, can or complement, harmonize, and stand to give an understanding of reality as a whole rather than as fragments. He therefore proposed the notion of noetic propedeutic as that which is the human consciousness that helps us to escape the problem and the Waterloo of inhempuchanya, which is the phenomenon of concealment. Noetic propedeutic becomes therefore the pedagogy, or what I call the psychotherapeutic dimension of Igbo Ndanda logic, that helps us to ensure that the mind is properly trained to grasp complements, to grasp entities, not as fragments, but rather as harmony, as complements. It is that education of the mind that is geared towards ensuring that the mind sees beyond the limitations of the narrow-minded, the polarization, discrimination, and division, into it being more reflective of others and therefore open to sincere, comprehensive dialogue, which stems from uniculturalism, multiculturalism, various culturalism. That is, you try to look beyond your own limited culture by trying to reflect into other people's culture, not from a biased perspective, but you are open-minded, all right, so that you can be able to understand other people's reality by putting yourself in their own shoes. The way forward with noetic propedeutic. It is therefore in this sense of invoking the logic of noetic propedeutic that we can rid our mind of those exclusive, disjointed, fragmented modes of thinking, all of which are often being encoded in our disjunctive faculty of reasoning, as they present us with such irreconcilable cognitive view of reality. Summary. In this paper, of course, because of time, I have been able to examine the nature of Asouzu's Igbo Ndanda complementary logic by taking a historical trajectory into the fundamental principles upon which Igbo Ndanda logic takes credence. I argue that Asouzu's complementary logic is founded on two basic principles: the principles of integration and the principle of progressive transformation. I also showed that these two principles influence the two major inferential modes, which is the conjunctive reasoning and then the disjunctive reasoning. And I went further to show how these two modes in their separate units cannot map reality fully from their respective vantages due to their marginal presentation of reality. As a spokesperson for Asouzu, I argued that complementary logic is a better framework for grounding social relationships through what Asouzu have termed complementary conjunctive reasoning as against binary oppositions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nelson, for your insightful lecture. Thank you so much. Please, if you have questions or comments, you can raise your hand and I will call you out. Kindly note that each person should just ask one question, and we have room to entertain 2 questions. Others can leave their questions on the chat box and the conversation will continue from there. So Techno, please, can you unmute yourself and ask your question or comments? Umezrike, please, if you are there, unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Amara. And thank you, Mr. Presenter, Nelson, for this wonderful talk. I think in the course of your presentation, you seem to have, in a way, misinterpreted Asouzu somehow, especially when you are talking about his 2 core principles, the principle of integration or complementation, and that of the principle of progressive transformation. And I was wondering, and I would like to know what you think can be seen as, difference between his principle of progressive transformation and that of his imperative principle. But he seems to be stating his imperative principle in placement of his principle of progressive transformation. That is one. 2, I think.
Please, sorry, we have room for just 1 question from you. There is no time again, please. Okay, thank you, Mr. Nelson. Please keep your response very brief, please.
Okay. Well, as your question is simple, and then the response or reply is simple. I have not misinterpreted Asouzu. The truth is this: Asouzu talked about 2 basic principles. The principles of integration, which is a metaphysical principle, is there in the work, in his textbooks, which talks about the fact that everything that exists serves a missing link of reality. All right. Then he went further to talk about the principle of progressive transformation, which he calls a practical principle, as that which embodies the joy of being. And we cannot talk about the joy of being with outside of the logic of noetic propaedeutic. It is when you have come to that point of consciousness where you understand that reality is not fragmented from the perspective of the logical mode of disjunctive reasoning, but that reality is that which is fused from the perspective of conjunctive reasoning. All right. It is with that basic understanding, from that foundation, that you will now take you will delve into an understanding of what he calls the principle of noetic propaedeutic, which is an education of the mind that tend to look at reality not as fragment but as a whole. And it's a practical principle. We look at it in everything that we do, in social relationships, that we are not looking at, when we approach reality, we should not look at the other person first because of tribe. Okay, it's not for a person from our tribe. That is that which is colored by the disjunctive mode of reasoning, which Asouzu argued that it is disjunctive because it does not consider missing links as complementary, but rather as that which is ontologically separate, divisive, and fragmented. Thank you.
Okay, so can I say something?
Please,
okay,
there is no time for that. Please, you can continue the conversation after the conference, please. Thank you, Nelson, for such brief response. We'll be taking the last question or comment from Osita. Osita, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Osita, so I'm a student of philosophy. I thank you, Mr. Presenter. On the Asouzu complementary logic, I see a bit of a correlation with the Ijiomah logic. And the question I wanted to ask with regards to Ijiomah is also applies to Asouzu, complementary logic. Now, we are taking this logic, and that is my contention, just as the former speaker said, as an African philosophical logic. And I'm afraid these ideas have been there. The ideas questioning the binary logic, the ideas questioning two value logic. Yeah, the Aristotelian, the logic that goes back to Aristotelian tradition, and that of the tradition of Frege and Russell came with a binary logic, two value logic. But many thinkers have been tinkering on this, on the three value logic. And we can remember immediately somebody like Stefan Lupascu, who wrote his Principle of Antagonism in 1951, where he expanded this particular thing and questioned the second axiom of Aristotelian logic, that is the axiom of exclusive meadow, the theorem non datur. So I'm asking, is Ijiomah's logic or Asouzu complementary logic not a kind of giving an Igbo linguistic coating to an existing debate? What is peculiarly African? I think it's about human thought coming to reason and seeing that things are not just black and white, A and non-A. That between A and non-A, there is a T state. That is what Lupascu was arguing for. There's a T state that is neither A or non-A. That could either be A or non-A. In other words, the three value logic is human. It's about humanity trying to grasp with the complexity found in reality, and not just an African thing. It's not a way of Africans think. It's a way humans think. And then if there is a limitation to the logic of the West, Aristotelian tradition, it's not just the logic of the West as such, but logic that goes back to Aristotelian tradition. So if we are giving it an Igbo coating or bringing Igbo name to explain it, let it be that we are appropriating this logic to our own context, and not that we are bringing any specific logic that is peculiarly African. An African, of course, has a question mark. Let us say peculiarly Igbo, so to speak. That is my own contention. Thank you.
Okay, if I may respond, first and foremost, I beg to differ that Asouzu's logic or even Ijiomah's logic is simply a repetition of what has been, or put in your words, if I will quote you right, a cultural logic, so to speak, that we just call it what it is. You see, we must understand is this: every reality, there's a way people think. You know, the Westerners, there's a way they think different from the way Africans think. That is basic. The reason why it is that way is because now we try to look at things. Of course, we talked about the evolution of human thought. Now, when we talked about when the likes of Placid Temples proposed his Bantu philosophy, and was arguing that the people of the Bantu, they lack rationality, that they do not have an idea of the absolute, all right, that they're only given to vital force and all the rest. And the likes of Hegel was critical of Africans as illogical, lacking rationality. What is basic is that rationality is common, all right, but the way in which our notion of rationality is being applied is different from culture to culture. Chimakonam has talked about the nature of context, all right, the context of such facts, that you can apply a particular situations within context. So we must always look at context. For instance, if you travel abroad, if you want to cross the road, you must not look at just the right side and the left hand side. Of course, there is the overhead bridge, you know, where we have trains that trains fly those areas. There's also the underneath, you know, beneath the ground and all those kind of things, where these vehicles and trains also fly. So you must look at things from different perspectives. The argument Asouzu, Ijiomah, and some of these people are trying to put forward is the fact that reality is relative, depending to culture, all right? It is also universalizable, even though Igbo and Danda philosophy stems from a particular culture. It is not limited within that culture. That is why in his 2004 book, The Method and Principle of Complementary Reflection, he added the phrase, in and beyond African philosophy. That phrase tells us that even though this method and principle of complementary reflection is rooted in African worldview or African experience, it can also it is born from African worldview, it can also be applied in other cultural realities, where maybe the Western culture, the Asian culture, the Indian culture. So the point we are making, in essence, is that reality is diverse. And even though they are diverse, each diversity in reality can be fused together when we understand that they all serve as necessary links to themselves and not as divisions or fragments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Nelson, for your responses, and thank you to those that asked questions and contributed.